Okay, hello again and welcome back. I'm sorry we had a small technical hitch at the start of our event today, but thank you for staying with us and welcome to the official launch of IEA's Energy Efficiency 2022, our annual market report that looks at energy efficiency issues globally. And of course, it's a particularly pertinent time to be discussing these issues. And I'm pleased to be joined by several of the key authors of the report. But first, I'm pleased to introduce our Director of Energy Markets and Security, Kesuke Sadamori, to say some opening remarks. Kesuke, please.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning to all from Paris. So today marks the launch of the IEA's 2022, the Energy Efficiency Market Report. As we will hear from my colleagues, the Energy Efficiency 2022 takes a look back at the past 12 months of developments in the energy efficiency landscape. This year, we have seen the world's first truly global energy crisis with significant negative impacts on citizens and businesses around the world, and the governments facing the challenge of addressing the crisis. The IEA has supported all of them throughout the year. At the start of the crisis, we produced two 10-point plans to help governments to reduce reliance on Russian natural gas and to cut oil use. In April, we reached out directly to consumers through the Playing My Part campaign to help them understand how to reduce energy demand. We extended this to small businesses with the Coping with the Crisis analysis in October. Very soon, the IEA will publish its recommendations on the steps governments can take to prepare for the next winter. Energy efficiency is the important thread that brings all of this work together, as it is the best way to simultaneously protect consumers from high prices, safeguard energy supply, and get on track for net zero. The past investments in more efficient buildings, vehicles, and industries are paying dividends today, saving consumers thousands of dollars in energy bills and improving business competitiveness. This shows us that raising ambition on efficiency can make our economies more resilient for future crises and help us out of the current one. The last energy crisis of this scale happened in the 1970s. When oil prices jumped to record levels, governments responded with major efforts to use energy more efficiently. As a result, they greatly improved the cars we drive, the appliances we use, and the homes we live in. And we're still feeling the benefit of this today through lower bills and emissions and greater energy security. The key question for governments now, and what we examine in this report, is whether 2022 will be seen as the start of another great turning point for energy efficiency. We are seeing some signs of this through record levels of investment, major new policies, and a growing number of citizens who are taking actions to reduce their energy demand. However, we are still waiting to see if this momentum will be sustained with real action on the ground in the coming years. The IEA has long understood the importance of energy efficiency, and we hope that 2022 will prove to be the year of a global turning point. And we will continue our work helping governments and the international community by providing analysis, policy recommendations, and real-world solutions to ensure more efficient, secure, and sustainable energy for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kesuke. Thank you for those opening remarks. I think really sets the scene strategically and reminds us how important energy efficiency and energy usage issues are right now. So we're going to hear from the lead authors of the report. Before I do, let me just tell you that we're keen to hear your views. So please do get in touch. First of all, you can download the report for free at our website, but also during this live stream, if you wish to ask questions of the authors, please email us directly at energy.efficiency@iea.org, or you can find me on Twitter, Brian or Motherway. Very happy to hear questions there as well. And if you tweet me or email us, we'll put those questions directly to the authors. And let's go now straight away to the first lead author, who's going to talk about the Energy Efficiency Market Report 2022. You'll see when you download the report that it covers three main themes: the recent trends right up to today in energy efficiency, looking particularly at the role of energy efficiency during the crisis. And we have a special chapter looking at the Southeast Asia region that we're going to tell you about today as well. So without further ado, over to this year's lead author of Energy Market 2022, Dr. Nicholas Hart. Nick, please.
Thank you, Brian. It will be no surprise that this year's Energy Efficiency Market Report is framed by the current energy crisis. Energy price and supply chain pressures that were already brewing last year have been amplified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent sanctions and disruption to energy and broader economic markets. Energy efficiency is now at the center of policy agendas as governments and citizens around the world urgently look to save energy, secure supply, and reduce energy bills. From the crisis arises the first message of our report, that we are seeing strong signs of governments turning to efficiency as it is the best way to simultaneously meet energy affordability, security, and climate goals. Given this economic backdrop, it should also be no surprise that global energy intensity improvements are expected to perform strongly in this year, up 2%, almost 4 times the rate achieved over the last 2 years. Energy intensity is the leading measure of energy efficiency at the economy-wide level and represents the total amount of energy needed to produce 1 unit of GDP. However, this year's result comes after 5 years of improvements, averaging only around 1% per year, far off track from the 4% annual improvement needed on average each year over this decade to achieve global climate goals and align with the IEA net zero scenario. This brings us to the central question, which we explore in this year's report. Is 2022 likely to be a turning point for energy efficiency? Something we are tracking very closely are changes in energy demand, which are one of the main drivers of energy intensity progress. In tracking the dynamics of energy demand over the last few years, we saw a contraction of around 4% in 2020 due to the initial impact of COVID restrictions, followed by a strong rebound of just over 5% in 2021. This compares with longer-term growth over the last decade of between 1.3 and 1.7% per year. In the building sector, energy consumption rose by 5 times more in 2021 than it fell the year before due to COVID. While space and water heating are the largest energy consumers in the building sector, space cooling is growing the fastest, up 6.5% in 2021 as more people gain access to air conditioners for the first time, particularly in the ASEAN region. Transport energy demand has also recovered strongly, up 8% in 2021, but still not reaching pre-COVID levels. Sectors such as aviation remain below their pre-pandemic state. Industrial energy demand was least negatively impacted through the COVID crisis, holding steady in 2020 and experiencing one of its strongest years of growth in recent times in 2021. This brought about a shift in the makeup of energy demand towards more energy-intensive industry over the last few years and was one of the main explanations for slower efficiency progress at the global level during the COVID pandemic. This year, we are tracking on a daily basis how energy demand is shifting in relation to the crisis. This year, initial data suggests a significant moderation in overall energy demand growth as consumers and markets are impacted by high energy prices and supply pressures, with growth dropping back from 5% last year to be closer to around 1% at the global level. Energy-related cost of living pressures are a major concern this year, driven by high fossil fuel prices. Increased energy costs have been the single biggest contributor to inflation experienced this year in most countries, pushing up the cost of living for families worldwide and setting back progress on energy access in emerging and developing countries. Energy poverty is not only a financial issue facing people, but a health one, with individuals and families facing the prospect of having to cut back on energy consumption and comfort levels in order to meet household budgets. To address these cost of living pressures, governments have allocated more than $550 billion in temporary support to help with affordability this year. In emerging market and developing economies, the value of this temporary support now exceeds that provided for clean energy investments since 2020. Of course, the energy crisis is particularly more acute in countries with greater exposure to natural gas in their energy mix. Heating is one of the most important areas where energy efficiency can help in this regard. Natural gas is the dominant fuel used for heating worldwide, representing around 40% of residential heating demand globally. However, the exposure to gas in the heating mix varies widely among countries, with some almost independent from gas and others using it for the majority or almost all of their heating needs. Across the world, governments are moving fast to bring in measures to reduce this exposure, in particular in Europe, where countries representing around 80% of residential gas demand have plans to ban or phase out new gas heating connections in the coming years. Efficiency measures are the first best policy to reduce the impact of rising energy bills. Here we see the annual residential energy bill for a typical building categorized by efficiency level. Those who live in an average home in the more efficient B and C class are more protected from rising prices, with energy bills around 40% lower than for people who live in a less efficient home. For families in the least efficient homes, they can be paying up to 3 times more for the same level of comfort. Unfortunately, the evidence we have gathered suggests that it is those who are least able to afford energy who are often the most exposed to poor quality, low efficiency housing. This underscores the importance of government retrofit programs that target those facing energy poverty and live in poor quality housing conditions, such as the Energy Affordability Program and Greener Homes Initiative in Canada, which provide free home energy needs assessments and energy saving kits for eligible households and help with other home upgrades, such as more efficient heating. This example is for a typical home in the United Kingdom, but the same story is true in every country. A similar situation exists with transport energy costs, which typically represent around half the energy bill of most families and households around the world. New, more efficient cars can be around 40% cheaper to run than less efficient models in the same class, and electric vehicles can be typically around half the cost compared to their most efficient conventional equivalents. In addition to helping with affordability, energy efficiency plays a vital role in delivering energy security. What we see in this chart are the forces pushing global energy demand higher through economic activity, such as higher incomes, rising population and business activity, as well as structural shifts towards or away from more energy-intensive activities. These are offset by the energy moderating forces of improved efficiency. On balance, efficiency gains have halved the potential growth in energy demand over the last 6 years, taking vital pressure off the need for greater fossil fuel consumption and more power stations. In IEA countries alone, such efficiency actions taken over the last 20 years have reduced this year's energy bill by $680 billion based on current energy prices. To put this in perspective, this represents around 15% of total energy expenditure in IEA countries this year. Efficiency is also one of the largest measures to reduce global CO2 emissions. Since 2000, there has been upwards pressure on CO2 emissions arising from higher populations and incomes, which has been moderated by improvements in efficiency and energy intensity. In the most recent decade, the effect of efficiency has been even greater as the rate of energy intensity progress almost doubled between the 2 decades. When combined with shifts in carbon intensity of the energy mix, the effect on lowering CO2 emissions has been even greater. The net effect of these changes means the efficiency gains of the last 20 years have halved the potential emissions growth from rising incomes and population. Without these efficiency improvements, CO2 emissions would be around 30% higher today. An important positive trend we observed this year in 2022 has been continued strong growth in energy efficiency related investment. This is expected to be up 16% this year, rising to 560 billion. This year's result builds on last year's extremely strong growth of 25%, boosted by COVID recovery packages and rebounding economic activity, especially in the building sector. This year, we saw a switch in the prime driver of efficiency-related investment to transport investment, which was up 47%, driven by the rapid uptake of electric vehicles, which made up 1 in every 8 vehicles sold this year. Recent policy announcements, such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, the Repower EU package in Europe, and the Green Transformation GX plan in Japan, are said to increase the overall level of efficiency investment even further, with levels expected to reach 1 trillion in the second half of this decade, as tracked by the IEA's announced policies scenario. However, these levels still need to be boosted by around 1/3 to be consistent with the levels needed in the IEA net zero scenario. One area where we have seen strong growth has been in electric heat pumps, particularly in Europe, where the number of units sold have increased by around 30% each year for the last 2 years. This has been driven by strong policy support in the form of incentive programs in many countries, helping address the issue of relatively higher upfront costs for heat pumps. Heat pumps are a key technology to reduce reliance on Russian gas in Europe, and as found in the IEA's special report on the topic released this week, achieving heat pump sales of 4 million units per year by 2025 can reduce EU annual gas consumption by 7 billion cubic meters a year, roughly equivalent to the amount of gas provided to Europe by the Trans-Adriatic pipeline last year. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Melanie Slade.
Many thanks. This year, we wanted to take a thorough look at one of the areas where we do a lot of work, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. ASEAN is home to more than 660 million people. Most of the economies have doubled in size over the last 2 decades, and the region is currently enjoying economic growth of about 5% a year. It's becoming one of the world's largest single markets. And at the same time, energy demand is growing by about 3% a year. But between now and 2030, about 3/4 of that demand is expected to be met by fossil fuels. So there's got a lot to be gained by improving energy efficiency in the region. So growth in energy demand in ASEAN in recent years has significantly outpaced the rest of the world in most sectors. Buildings have seen a bit of a decline, even though the building stock is growing rapidly, but that's largely due to a decrease in traditional biomass, which is used in this region for cooking. But at the same time, electricity is growing rapidly. The ASEAN region, access to modern energy services has been improving, particularly in terms of both cooking and electricity. So in terms of cooking, Around 70% of the population now has access to clean cooking, but there are still 200 million people in the region who are being left behind. And our analysis shows that even by 2050, about 100 million people will probably still not have access to clean cooking services. The damage to health, gender inequalities, and environmental impacts are valued by the World Bank of 280 billion US dollars a year. Access to electricity in ASEAN is much higher, at about 95% of the population, with the aim to have universal access being on track for 2030. Unfortunately, globally, both due to COVID and the current energy crisis, about 100 million people are likely to revert to traditional biomass for cooking, and about 70 million people who had recently gained access to electricity can no longer afford it. The electricity consumption in ASEAN is driven by air conditioning and buildings. This is one of the fastest growing end uses and is expected to quadruple by 2040. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that energy efficient air conditioners are cheaper to own over their lifetime, but you might be surprised to know that they don't even have to cost more to buy. In Thailand, for example, for a typically priced machine, the efficiency can vary by a factor of 1.6. The reason we're doing this analysis is to convince governments that they can be more ambitious with their policy settings and without affecting consumers with higher upfront costs. More ambitious policies could see space cooling energy consumption in the region reduced by about a third by 2040. We're all familiar with the traditional building energy efficiency policies, but in a region like ASEAN, where building stock is growing so rapidly, buildings need to be future-proofed and building codes modernised. If not, inefficiency and inflexibility can be locked in for decades. We need to shift from the status quo to highly efficient buildings, to adding on-site renewables, and then smart control systems to enable buildings to become flexible resources for the grid. This way, buildings can help integrate the higher rates of renewables needed to clean the energy supply in the region. Transport's another regional priority. Globally, fuel economy standards play a key role in reducing future oil requirements in the transport sector. But at the moment, none of the ASEAN member states have adopted fuel economy or CO2 emission standards for any modes of transport. 2- and 3-wheelers are key transport modes in ASEAN, and they provide opportunities for electrification, driven largely by air pollution in cities, but also by the increasing availability of electricity. We have a broad range of projects in ASEAN, from roadmaps, long-term roadmaps for efficiency in space cooling and buildings, online training on a whole range of policy measures. And we are making sure that we cover the whole package of regulation, information, and incentives. And with that, I'll hand back to Brian.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you, Nick, for your overview. And so, colleagues, as we examine the question before us, which is, are we going to see 2022 as a turning point for energy efficiency? There are certainly many reasons to be optimistic. We're seeing a massive amount of mobilization of finance, particularly through COVID recovery and crisis recovery measures right across the world. We're seeing many new national plans emerging related to climate and energy targets that have very strong focus and emphasis on energy efficiency. And even in the last few months, for obvious reasons, we've seen a large number of awareness and behavior change campaigns launched by governments right across the world, not least here in Europe, encouraging citizens to understand how they can reduce their energy costs and their energy usage. We're also seeing some interesting developments, as Mel has touched on already, in terms of the use of digital technologies to make grids smarter, to make better use of renewable resources coming on stream. Some very strong progress in key technologies such as heat pumps and electric vehicles. And then we are seeing some significant policy developments globally, not least in the cooling topic in ASEAN that Mel discussed, many new policies emerging, many new countries around the world putting in place strong building codes relating to energy efficiency and a strong progress in other sectors as well. And as you've heard from us today, our analysis shows that because of the progress, even just looking at the IEA countries made in the last 20 years in terms of better levels of energy efficiency, consumers this year are saving 680 billion dollars in this year alone in terms of lower energy costs, really crucial at this time. So we do see these glimmers of optimism, but of course we want to see the action on the ground. The IEA looks at the numbers. We see some positive trends in 2022, but we will wait to see whether they continue and whether all of this strong policy action really does deliver the much needed work on the ground in terms of greater levels of energy efficiency, lower bills, lower emissions. A key point will be implementation by governments and follow through on the policies and announcements that they have made. In that regard, we see ourselves in the IEA as a convener of governments around the world to help them understand how they can work together and how they can implement strong policies. And in fact, just recently, we held the IEA's 7th annual Global Energy Efficiency Conference in Denmark. We're very delighted to have been hosted by the Energy Minister of Denmark, where we brought together governments around the world, and they released a joint statement calling on governments and other actors around the world to strengthen their action on energy efficiency, and welcomed the publication of the Sonderberg Action Plan that the IEA produced in partnership with its Danish colleagues that really set out some of the best practice measures in energy efficiency around the world, learning from what's working as introduced by governments in every part of the world. And I'd encourage you to download that from our website. I'd also encourage you to download today's report. I'm pleased as well to let you know that next year's 8th annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency will take place in Paris in early June. We're delighted to be hosted by our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, as well as France's Minister for the Energy Transition, in partnership with our close working partner, Schneider Electric, to whom we're very grateful for all of their support. So do mark that in your diaries. We'll be telling you more soon about the 8th annual Global Conference taking place next June. Now, colleagues, you've heard about the overview of Energy Efficiency 2022. We're very keen to hear from you, so do please give us your questions. I see some coming in via email at energy.efficiency@iea.org. And you can also get to us via my Twitter account, which is at Brian or Motherway. Very keen to hear your questions. Nick, one that I'll start with you, if I can. You mentioned that we're seeing some moderation of demand in 2022, some evidence that consumers are changing their behavior. What are you seeing in terms of maybe consumers becoming more energy efficient or changing the way they use energy this year in 2022?
Thank you, Brian. And thanks for the question. You can get the full detail on this in our report. There's clearly a lot going on this year. And the cover of our efficiency market report of the Eiffel Tower with its lights turned off it is a symbolic gesture of how people and communities around the world are coming together in a bigger wave of energy saving awareness and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. While there are many factors behind moderating energy demand worldwide, in Europe this year, in the first half of the year, gas demand was 10% lower compared to the levels last year. So there is some evidence, and there are many factors going on behind that moderation of demand, that we are seeing a response coming through, and we expect the reduction to be even greater in the second part of the year. This, of course, is being supported by a lot of action in terms of government programs to support consumers change their behavior. On the transport front, Luxembourg, for example, has introduced one of the world's most generous public transport programs, making buses, trams, and trains free of charge throughout the country to encourage people to drive less and help with the cost of living. Similar schemes to make public transport cost less operate in Germany, Italy, Austria, Ireland, and many other countries, to name a few. Korea, the government is using a cashback scheme to encourage members of the public to reduce energy use by 10% this winter. And in Japan, the Tokyo Electric Power Company has launched a power saving challenge where points for saving energy can be exchanged for goods using Amazon. To help with this as well, retailers are being encouraged to use digital tools in Japan to provide hourly energy consumption and signals for demand response. And so there's clearly a mix of things going on that are helping consumers take action. And in support of all of these efforts, as colleagues mentioned earlier, the IEA with the European Commission launched the Playing My Part campaign with 9 simple actions that people can take, from adjusting thermostats for heating and cooling, adjusting boiler settings, and changing transport behavior. So yes, overall 2022 is shaping up to be a big year for energy saving.
Thank you, Nick. And yet, in the last few weeks, we've seen a certain moderation of prices in oil and gas in many parts of the world, but including here in Europe. Do you think that will change the landscape?
I think prices do have a strong effect on raising awareness in consumers' minds, but it is just one factor. I think there's a growing wave of awareness around energy saving, and it's not just related to climate, it's related to energy security, solidarity with people of Ukraine, and of course, climate change. So I think once this issue is on people's agenda, it's more likely to stay on it. And that is the hope as we go forward towards this potential turning point. And this is very much what we're looking at in the report when we talk about the momentum going forward beyond what's happened this year into next year and the years after.
Thank you, Nick. A question that came in via the email was to say, you mentioned a couple of technologies, heat pumps and electric vehicles, both seem to be growing very quickly this year in terms of their deployment. Are there other technologies you would name as key to energy efficiency ramp up? And secondly, how do you see the supply chain in terms of whether it's heat pumps, electric vehicles, other technologies? Will they be able to keep up with demand?
Sure, another really good question. Energy efficiency is characterized by literally hundreds, if not thousands, of technologies across all sectors of the economy and industry, transport, and buildings. The big one for this year that we see in the data are electric vehicles for transport. Electrification is having a moment. 1 in every 8 vehicles being sold is electric, as we cover. But there is concerns that supply chain pressures, lithium processing, semiconductor chips, manufacturing ability, and getting products from manufacturers to consumers and into people's homes, that this supply chain is holding back even faster progress. And I think many people who would want an electric vehicle or a heat pump are having to go on what would be overly long waiting lists to access these technologies, get them installed. And so you can read again about this more in the report, where we look at the supply chain issue in some detail and some of the things that governments are doing to make this process move faster and more seamlessly.
Thank you, Nick. Mel, there's a question that came in by our YouTube channel. You spoke very well about the Southeast Asia progress, but can you tell us what we're seeing in Africa and Latin America at the moment?
Thanks. One of the main things is that in both regions, groups of governments have decided to get together to work on the efficiency of energy using appliances, mainly domestic appliances, but also industrial motors. So there's a big movement towards trying to gain the benefits that the countries who've had these policies in place for decades have recouped already, and then to have those benefits in both regions. So that's one of the biggest areas of activity that we're seeing at the moment.
And there's a sense of, in what you're saying, for ASEAN and for the other regions, that maybe we're seeing more prioritization of efficiency than we have in the past. Is that driven this year by the crisis, or would you see it as a longer term trend? What would you see that is kind of generating more interest in energy efficiency in all parts of the world?
So in some parts of the developing and emerging world, the climate issue is coming higher up the agenda. We see that through the engagement in the multilateral conversations that are going on. So that's becoming more of a driver than it perhaps has been. But we still see air pollution as being one of the biggest drivers of efficiency in many parts of the world. But the huge inroads that countries like China and India have made have often been driven by air pollution. And also, of course, energy security. So it's always been the case that that's been a big driver for efficiency in these countries because of their concerns about oil imports in particular, but also now that's becoming more price sensitive. But it's more of the same, probably more acute, but similar motivations.
And in countries and regions where economies are growing fast, people are getting access to energy for the first time. People are starting to afford the benefits of energy that they couldn't afford before. Is there a sense of efficiency is not our priority? We want to use more energy. We want people to have access to more energy.
A sense, I think, from communities, from people who they want the services. They also want to buy cheap products, so they want the services at lowest cost. So this is where we're seeing these projects where governments are getting more involved. They're getting more interest in regulating, particularly to remove the lowest efficiency products from markets. That applies to appliances, it applies to buildings and cars, anywhere across the chain. So governments are seeing the need to take action because, on the whole, people are clearly, enjoying the services that they can access now.
Thank you, Mel. Nick, a question for you, and it actually relates back to something we published recently on our Tracking Clean Energy Progress report that showed that many areas of technology are not making fast enough progress. But one that stood out for me that I noticed was lighting, where a move to efficient lighting is actually doing relatively well compared to other technologies. So tell us a little bit about progress in lighting. What's happening there and why is it going better than other technologies?
Thanks. Lighting is one of the few areas that is on track in terms of technology deployment towards meeting net zero targets. And a lot of progress has been made in both on the technical side and getting products out into the markets. And LED lights now, for example, constitute around 50% of the lighting used in many European countries. Now, these lights are many times more cost many times much less to use than their counterparts, compact fluorescents or incandescent bulbs. And analysis in the market report that we have done, that's been done, suggests that around 188 terawatt hours per year additional could be saved by switching out the other 50% of lights that is still yet to be changed over from conventional lighting to LED lighting. Now, to put that in some perspective, this is the equivalent electricity required to operate some 47 million heat pumps per year. And so how efficient devices work together in the home can be an important part of keeping the pressure on the grid lower. As more electric vehicles, more heat pumps are added. Measures such as switching out your old lights with modern efficient LEDs can play a major role to alleviate some of these grid pressures.
Thank you, Nick. So friends, we have other good questions coming in, but I'm afraid time is upon us, so we have to draw to a close. But do please follow up, send us your questions, and we'll happily reach out to you afterwards. And if you have questions or comments on the report, you can find the report on our website, iea.org, and you're very welcome to get in touch and continue the conversation as we go forward. We'll be producing other analysis soon and other events on the topics, so do please stay in touch with us as we go forward. And again, do please mark your calendars next year for June for the 8th Annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency in Paris, France. So let me thank you all for joining us today. Let me thank Nick Howarth, our principal author and presenter, Mel Slade, and all of the colleagues here at the IEA who helped produce what I think you'll find is a very interesting and insightful report. And we look forward to you reading it and getting in touch to talk about it further. Thank you very much.